Hi guys, my name is Dhruv Sharma and I welcome you all on the session on Ansible series. So we'll be covering Ansible in two sessions. In session number one, we'll look and understand how Ansible can be used from the CLI perspective, that is through the command line. And in session number two, we will understand how we can use Ansible using GUI, that is Ansible Tower. And these sessions will be very focused on the network side of Ansible. But Ansible can be used to manage devices, not just the network devices, but other devices like Red Hat or web servers. But we will focus on only the network side of Ansible. So the Cisco routers or Cisco devices can be managed by administrators via SSH, where administrators log in on those devices, connect to them over SSH. They can use softwares like PuTTY, log in on them, and manages them. We can create VLANs, we can create configured interfaces, and so many items we can perform, so many actions we can perform. The similar set of actions can also be performed by Ansible. So just to explain you, so let's suppose that's a user's laptop or a desktop, and this administrator is trying to manage one Cisco switch and one Cisco router. He connects into these devices using PuTTY and manages them. He creates VLANs, he deletes VLANs, he configures access list and all, which is an easy job. But for instance, the list of routers can increases from 1 to 100, and the list of switches can increase from 1 to 50. Then configuring devices to which are when the list is too huge can be a cumbersome task, and it requires lots of administrators and lots of management. Managing so many devices can also lead to human errors. So rather than manually configuring each and every router and each and every switch, we can install a software on this laptop, which is known as Ansible. Once we have installed this software on this laptop, you can automate the scripts to be sent on all these network devices. And these devices will be automatically configured with the prerequisites. What I mean that you can configure some commands or some settings into these configuration files, which will be pushed down into the devices. And those configurations can be as complex as configuring 100 VLANs, configuring VTP to configuring access list, or it can be very simple like downloading or just do show running config. So CentOS or Ubuntu, any kind of software or any kind of server can be used to install the Ansible software. Currently, the machine must have Python or a newer version of Python should be installed on this host. But currently, Windows is not supported. So this node where the Ansible is installed, we call it as a control node. It's just a name. You could have given name as a player node, but we call this as a control node. And the control node is used to manage the end devices. That can be a Cisco router, or it can be a server. But this video is very much focused on the network element of Ansible. So to install, so let's first get into the very basics. To install an Ansible, we just need to run some commands. So if you're trying to install your Ansible on CentOS, then you just need to run these two commands. And to check the version, this command must be used. Similarly, you can install Ansible on Ubuntu system as well. This is what I'm using currently in my lab. You just need to run these set of commands. An Ansible version, again, can be verified using Ansible ---- version. Currently in my lab, I'm using the version 2.9.27. This is my lab topology, where I'm using an Ansible software and which is running on an Ubuntu machine, which is connected to a Cisco switch, and I'm trying to manage a couple of routers and switches. Before we look into the topology and the practical aspects of it, let's understand the building blocks, the key terms of Ansible. First, we start with the control node. That can be an Ubuntu or a CentOS machine where the Ansible software is actually installed. That can be a laptop, that can be a server. The managed nodes. The managed nodes are the devices that Ansible can manage. That can be a Cisco router or a Cisco switch. The inventory. The inventory is a piece of document that specifies the name of Cisco, or I would say then the piece of document that lists the managed nodes. It will going to have a list of routers or switches that can be managed by the control node. This file is installed or in the control node inventory file. The modules. Modules are basically the set of I would say the best way to describe is the functionality what control node can perform. When I say the functionality, the example of some modules are Cisco iOS, Cisco ACI, checkpoint. So these are the modules, which means that we can run or automate the devices from this category. So we can automate a checkpoint firewall, we can automate Cisco ACI switches, and we can automate Cisco iOS based routers or switches. Within the module, if you open a module, you can look into various tasks. Like Cisco iOS supports configuring VLANs, configuring the IP, or configure an ACL. Within an ACI, the certain tasks are configuring the EPG, configuring a bridge domain, configuring an L3 out. So these are the actual tasks, actual actions which we like to perform. So these are the tasks. And the playbooks is again a piece of document which is again installed on the control node. That document basically lists the modules and the task. That playbook has to be downloaded or should be added on the control node. And the last is the handlers. We're going to look into the handlers at the very end. So by now, I believe you guys must have confidence or the basic understanding what this Ansible is all about. And the configuration is absolutely very simple, isn't it? Just run these commands and absolutely you can install Ansible on any device. Or when I say any device, you have to meet the prerequisite. So let's look into these key terms in some more details. Control node, that can be a laptop, server, or switch. It cannot be used. It cannot be a Windows, obviously, and it needs to be installed with Python. The managed devices, as I mentioned, that are Cisco routers or switches in our case, and we just need to ensure that SSH is enabled between the control node and the end devices. The inventory is, as I mentioned previously, is a piece of document that identifies the list of hosts that can be automated. So all the nodes must be listed in this piece of document. We also specify the username and password that a user on a remote machine can use to, or so we have to provide an admin credentials that has sufficient privileges to log in into these devices and perform the changes. And the modules. I think we discussed about these modules previously as well, that what modules is, but I'm going to show you the modules in further details. So if I open this document and bring up my browser, you can get hold of this slides from the description below. And from here, you can see for Ansible version 2.9, these are the modules which are available. Modules for ACI, Aruba, ASA, AVI, Big Switch, Checkpoint, and whatnot. Since we are focusing on our Cisco IOS routers and switches, these are the modules for Cisco IOS. Within the Cisco IOS module, you can log in into the module for more details. Within the module Cisco IOS interfaces, we can basically do pretty much everything with respect to the interfaces, where we can configure the interfaces, assign MTU, and shut it down or perform any other changes. One of the major challenges, what I personally felt when I was during my initial days of learning Python, that I was trying to go on internet and try to download some configuration or examples from internet. And when I try to use those examples or playbooks, those playbooks didn't work in my lab environment. Later on, I realized that, and that the reason why it didn't work because the user who created those playbooks were basically using different Ansible version, so the syntax changed, or different Python version, so the syntax changed. So ensure that you filter out the right Ansible version, and the best way to get the right syntax is from your Ansible control node itself. I will show you how to do that. So coming back to the slides. So over here, you can see that all these modules are available, and within the module, we can look into the task, what we can perform. Although Ansible ships up with 80 to 85% of the tasks what we would like to perform using Ansible, like configuring VLANs and most of the options. But if in case you're looking for something else, then you can create your own modules. But that requires some scripting skills. If you're not or if you're not from a DevOps environment, or you're not a software guy, in that case, you can use the pre-built network modules. You can look into modules from the CLI as well using this command. And the best way I personally found is to look for a network module using locate command. How I personally do it, I used to go on the browser and search for the right module. And then I go back on the CLI, that search that module from the CLI, and then cat the the Python program and get more details out of it. I will explain you that in the coming slides when we do the labs. I mean, the task, as I mentioned, the tasks are the actual action we are trying to perform. So the module is iOS command module, but the task is to run show running config. Playbooks is a piece of document that is installed on the control node, and it includes the module and the task. Module and the task. So every playbook is being denoted when we run a playbook. The results will be displayed to us in 3 colors. Green color shows that the task has been executed, but no change was made on the end devices. What I mean that from your laptop, which is installed with the Ansible software, which turned your laptop into a control node, and now it has privileges to manage multiple routers. And if a script is pushed back to the router, this script is executed on the router, and post execution, the script didn't change anything on the router. It will be shown in the green color. For example, show running configuration. If the script executes show running configuration command on this end router, so it just runs it. So the output will be in green color. But if in case I send a script from Ansible to router to add a VLAN, then the script will be ran, but a change will be made on the end devices. So the output should be in a yellow color. However, if there is any error in my script, or the end device is not able to execute that script, the task will be failed and it will be shown in red color. I left handlers for the very end, and we don't use handlers very often, but yes, they can be used. Sometimes you want to run a task when a change is made on the machine. For example, there is a router and the CPU utilization of these routers reached 90%. And you want to run a certain task when a certain uh, change happens on the machine, then you can use handlers. Isn't it something similar to SNMP? So now we're going to understand about building blocks. We learned about the key terms, but now we have to understand how these key terms are connecting, how they are working closely with each other. So by default, when you install your Ansible on your control node, it will be installed with some default configuration. So the default configuration involves a default inventory file and default configuration file. Default inventory file is basically the file which has all host into it. As I mentioned, that inventory file uh, is the file that lists all the end host on it. And the configuration file is also is auto installed on the control node. So these files are installed by default, and the vendor do not recommend us to use the default configuration. Instead, we have to create our own inventory and host file in your home directory where playbooks will be placed. These are the default location of your configuration file and the host file. For instance, we create a folder, bobby.com. For our customer, let's say I'm working for a company, abc.corps, and we have a customer, bobby.com. And within the folder, bobby.com, we created our own configuration file, inventory file, and a playbook. So this is a control node. And this control node is used to manage the end nodes, which can be routers or switches. The list of these end nodes are mentioned in the inventory file, which we call as hosts. And playbook is a document that has modules and tasks. Modules can be iOS module, and the task is to create a VLAN or add an IP. So whenever a user, an administrator, try to run a playbook, it will contact the CFG file, the configuration file. And the configuration file will go and contact, will always point towards the host file. The host file identifies the end users or end servers. Once they are being identified, the playbook is executed. Please remember that once you have the CFG file placed in your custom folder, it will take preference to system default configuration file. If in case your custom CFG file is not available, it will go and check for system default configuration file. That's an example of the configuration file, which is pointing towards an host file, which is the inventory file. So inventory file has the list of all the end host. Optionally, it can also have the credentials. These are the credentials which can be used by the Ansible to log in on these devices to manage them. We can run the Ansible script using this command, Ansible hyphen playbook space playbook name.yaml. All the playbooks are written in YAML and hence YML extension. To ensure that there is no syntax error in your host file when you create it, you can run this command. And if you feel like you are good with Ansible, you can also clear these certifications provided by Red Hat. And now some lab fun. Let me bring up my jump server. I have installed my Ansible on this Ubuntu workstation. So this Ubuntu workstation is pretty is pretty standard feature. So it is not having a you can let me show you the configuration. It has very basic configuration. It can be a laptop, 8 GB RAM, hard disk 20 GB, and pretty standard, isn't it? And if I show you for my customer, Bobby.com, I created a separate folder within my home directory where I have the host file, that is the inventory file, configuration file, and the playbooks. So the configuration file, that's a custom configuration file. I'm not using the system default configuration file. The configuration file is pointing towards the inventory, the host file. And the host file has list of end servers which we are trying to manage. So in our case, we have a Cisco router. It's a CSR router, as you can see, and a Cisco switch. I have SSH access to these devices. The configuration is pretty standard, and you can see it on the screen. And that's a playbook. So when we execute this playbook, so it shows that the host we are trying to execute this playbook on is just Cisco-switch. This is the module which shows, which dictates to create a VLAN 11, and then same module assign the VLAN to an interface. But when we execute this playbook, it uh, it first goes back to the configuration file. Configuration file points to the host file, and the host file has the list of end host. Because playbook cannot understand what Cisco switch is, and the host file will only tell that Cisco switch name's IP is 192.168.11.50. So the complete link will be step list from playbook to the inventory file via CFG. Since the host file is in the same folder, as we can see, to the configuration file, we haven't provided the complete directory. There is no need to provide it. If you just mention inventory equal to host, it will work. If you look into any other inventory file for any other playbook for reference, playbook 1, it is trying to reach CSR router, which is in our case is this, and it is just trying to run this command, show running configuration. No changes. It is just trying to run show running configuration on the router. But remember, we can increase the list of the CSR router from 1 to 100. And the same command will be run within a single click. Going back to the CLI, as I mentioned, to run a playbook, the syntax is playbook. Sorry, Ansible playbook, and the playbook name, and enter. As you can see, the playbook is successfully executed, and it has downloaded all the configuration, that is a show running configuration, from the router. If I open the playbook again for reference, playbook 1, show running configuration from CSR router, and CSR router is 1111.51. I know for a single router, you don't like to use an Ansible, but let's assume you're trying to download the configuration for 30 routers, like taking a backup of 20 or 30 CSR routers. Ansible will definitely save your time. Let's look into something more complex. We have a second playbook right now with us. We have on a Cisco switch. This time we want to create a VLAN 11. And once the VLAN is created, we want to add a VLAN to an interface. Let's log in on the switch. Currently, this VLAN has VLAN 1, 10, and 100 on it. So what we're trying to achieve with this script now, we want to create VLAN 11 and assign gig 0/2 to that VLAN. The playbook name is barbie5.yaml, and enter. And it is successfully executed. Let's go back to the switch. Here we can verify the changes have been made. Show VLAN. And now you can see the VLAN is being created and assigned to gig interface 0/2. But previously, there was no VLAN. And now the VLAN is created. All without the human efforts. This was simple, but now the bigger question is how we can create our own Ansible scripts or playbooks. You can get hold of all the playbooks what I have from my GitHub repository. I have pasted my GitHub link in the video description. And you can get your own, you can get hold of all my playbooks from here for Cisco iOS. But I highly recommend you to create your own playbooks, which is super easy. To create your own playbooks, how I started it is by going back to the document. This online document, which has list of all the modules. Select the module which is interested, copy it, Go back to your control node. Use locate or find command to locate your module. Okay, sorry, I didn't pasted the complete path. Paste, and you are in the module section and ls. And you can see within the iOS module, these are Python scripts what you can use. Open the module which you like to use. Within the module, as a beginner, I highly recommend you to use the examples. They are the right scripts or the syntax which you should use in your environment. What happened with me personally, I just want to share my personal experiences. When I started learning Ansible, I tried to use playbooks available on the forums or on the Cisco forums or on GitHub. And when I tried to run it in my environment, it failed. And I struggled for weeks and weeks and weeks. But later on, I realized that when I looked into these modules and when I started using the examples, it worked. The reason why it didn't work earlier because the 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 engineers who created those playbooks, they were using a different Python version and a different Ansible version. If you look into my playbook, I created it something. I just copied it a few hours back before I created this video today. So if you can see, I just used the same name. I just replaced the VLAN ID, and the rest everything is pretty much same. So in that way, you won't do any mistake from the syntax point of view. Because in some Ansible version, it will just use Cisco. I've seen that some versions it just use iOS VLANs, and it worked. But for me, it won't work. So you have to follow what is there for your Ansible version. I'm using Ansible 2.9.27. So even for the minor version that is .27, if you're using .26, it may or may not work for my scripts. May not work for you. So I hope this session is informative to you. And in the second session, I'm going to make a session on Ansible Tower. We're going to perform all these changes, building a playbook. Where we're going to create a playbook, create a host file, and create a configuration file through a GUI. And this GUI is known as Ansible Tower. And I hope this session has been informative to you. And thank you for joining.